You wake up to silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that presses against your ears like a weight. You're lying in a stone house barely taller than you are, and the cold seeps through the walls like something alive. Outside, the wind howls across fjords that stretch into darkness. You haven't seen the sun in weeks. The last ship from Norway came 3 years ago. You're waiting for the next one. You keep waiting. But here's the thing, that ship is never coming, and you don't know it yet. This is Greenland. The year is somewhere in the early 1400s. You are one of roughly 5,000 Norse colonists living at the edge of the known world. Your ancestors sailed here 4 centuries ago, carving farms from frozen earth, building churches, paying tithes to a pope who has never seen snow like this. You believed this land would sustain you. You believed the old country would remember you. You were wrong on both counts, because within a single generation, every single person in this colony will vanish. No battles, no ships full of survivors, just empty farms, scattered bones, and a silence that will stretch for centuries. This is the story of how an entire civilization disappeared from the face of the earth while the rest of Europe looked the other way. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why they died, why no one came to help them, and why the most terrifying part isn't that they starved. It's that they chose to starve rather than survive. If this is gripping you, hit like and subscribe, because the next part gets a lot worse. But before you can understand how 5,000 people vanished, you need to understand how they got there in the first place, and more importantly, why they stayed. The Norse colonization of Greenland begins in the summer of 986, when a man named Eric the Red sails west from Iceland with 25 ships. He's been exiled for murder. Not his first, not his last, but he's charismatic and he's desperate and he's got a gift for selling dreams. He calls the land Greenland, even though it's mostly ice, because he knows branding matters. He promises fertile valleys, endless pasture, a place where a man can own land instead of renting it from Norwegian lords. 14 of those 25 ships make it, roughly 450 people. They settle 2 clusters of farms along the southwest coast, where the fjords cut deep and the grass grows thick enough to feed livestock for part of the year. And for a while, it works. By the year 1100, there are roughly 3,000 Norse Greenlanders. By 1200, closer to 5,000. They raise cattle, sheep, goats. They hunt seals and caribou. They trade walrus ivory and polar bear pelts back to Europe, luxuries that fetch premium prices in the markets of Bergen and beyond. They build churches, lots of them, 16 parishes, a cathedral at Gardar with stained glass windows shipped from Norway. They pay their tithes in walrus tusks and sealskin rope. They send their sons to study in Nidaros. They write letters to the Archbishop of Trondheim, asking for guidance on religious festivals. They are, by every measure they understand, civilized, Christian, European, Norwegian subjects living in a distant land, but still part of the kingdom, still part of Christendom. And that's the trap, because what the Greenlanders don't realize, what they can't realize from where they're sitting, is that they are not just distant, they are expendable. And the systems they depend on, the trade routes, the church, the crown, are about to stop caring whether they live or die. Now watch what happens next. The climate starts to turn, slowly at first. The summers get shorter, the winters get longer and colder. This isn't sudden apocalypse. This is the little ice age creeping in, degree by degree, season by season. Pack ice starts forming earlier in the year, blocking the fjords, making navigation dangerous. The growing season shrinks, your hay yields drop. You can't feed as many animals through the winter. So you cull your herds, you tighten your belts, you adapt, because that's what your people have always done. But here's what you can't adapt to: the ship schedule. Because Greenland has no trees, none that matter. You can't build ocean-going vessels. You depend entirely on ships from Norway to bring you iron, timber, grain, and to take your goods to market. And those ships come maybe once a year, sometimes less. They're not on a schedule, they come when it's profitable, and as the ice thickens and the routes get harder, the profit margin shrinks. Now think about the logic here. You're a Norwegian merchant, you've got a ship. You can sail to Iceland 1 week each way, reliable profit. Or you can sail to Greenland, 3 weeks if the weather's good, 6 weeks if it's not, and the harbors might be frozen when you get there. And the trade goods, walrus ivory, are nice but not essential. What do? You stop going to Greenland. The last reliably documented ship from Norway reaches Greenland in 1410. After that, silence. No ships, no trade, no contact. And for the Greenlanders, this is existential. Because you are not self-sufficient. You never were. You need iron to make tools. You need timber to repair your buildings. You need grain to supplement your failing harvests. You have none of these things. You have what you brought with you, and what you brought is running out. But here's the thing that makes this so much worse. You don't know you've been abandoned. You think the ships are just delayed. You think next summer, maybe the summer after, they'll come. You keep waiting. You keep preparing trade goods, stockpiling ivory, keeping your farms running the way your grandparents taught you, because you believe the system still works. You believe Norway still cares. You believe the church still remembers you, and that belief is what kills you. Let me show you how. The Greenland Norse are fanatically Christian, not casually, fanatically. Their entire identity is wrapped up in being civilized Christians at the edge of the world, separate from and superior to the Inuit. The native people they call Skraelings. The Inuit are thriving. They hunt seals from kayaks, they eat fish, they wear furs, they adapt. But to the Norse, this is barbarism. Eating fish is something you do when you're desperate, when you've lost your status. Seal hunting in Inuit-style boats? Unthinkable. That's native behavior. That's pagan. You are Norse. You are Christian. You eat beef and mutton and dairy. You farm the way your ancestors farmed in Norway. You wear wool even when fur would keep you warmer. You maintain the old ways because the old ways are what separate you from the savages. And here's where the system becomes a noose. The church demands tithes, 1/10 of your production. In good years, that's manageable. In bad years, it's brutal. But you pay, because refusing means excommunication, and excommunication means damnation. Your bishop lives in the cathedral at Garda, maintains his own estate, expects his due. The church owns land, lots of it, the best land, and charges rent. The church takes the best livestock. The church ships your walrus ivory back to Rome when ships are available to fund cathedrals you'll never see. And even as the colony is collapsing, even as your children are starving, the church does not release you from your obligations, because from Rome's perspective, from Trondheim's perspective, you are subjects, and subjects pay. Now think about what this means. You're trapped between two systems. The Norwegian crown expects taxes and loyalty but sends no ships. The church expects tithes and obedience but provides no relief. And both institutions are distant, abstract, unreachable. You can't appeal. You can't negotiate. You can't even get word out that you're dying because there are no ships. You are screaming into a void and the void doesn't care, and then it gets worse. The Inuit start moving south. They've always been here, in the north. But now they're coming into your territory. Not to invade. They're following the seals, adapting to the same climate shift that's killing you. They're not hostile. They're just present. And to the Norse, that presence is intolerable. Because acknowledging the Inuit means acknowledging that their way of life works and yours doesn't. It means admitting that the natives have something to teach you. And you can't do that. Your entire identity is built on being superior, on being Christian, on being civilized. So instead of learning, instead of trading, instead of adopting the kayaks and the fishing techniques and the fur clothing that would save your life, you double down. You pull inward. You cling harder to the old ways. You keep raising cattle even as your herds shrink. You keep wearing wool even as you freeze. You keep waiting for ships that will never come. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life looks like in the 1390s. You wake up in darkness because winter here lasts 8 months. Your house is built from stone and turf, thick walls that should keep heat in, but the wood for your roof beams is rotting and you have no timber to replace it. You can see your breath inside. Your children sleep in the same room, huddled under wool blankets that are threadbare because you have no new wool. Your flock is half the size it was when your father was alive. For breakfast, if you can call it that, you have a thin porridge made from barley that came on a ship 5 years ago. You're rationing it, stretching it. You don't know when the next supply will come. Your son is 12 and he's shorter than you were at his age, thinner. His teeth are already loose. You tell yourself it's normal, that children grow at different rates, but you know better. You've seen the old tapestries, the ones your grandmother brought from Norway, showing feasts with massive haunches of meat, tables overflowing. That world doesn't exist here, not anymore. You spend your morning checking on the cattle. You had 15 cows 3 years ago, now you have 6. You slaughtered the rest during the last winter because you couldn't feed them. The hay harvest was terrible. The growing season was too short. The frost came early. You're hoping these 6 survive until spring, but you can see their ribs. You can see yours too when you wash. Everyone is thinner now, everyone is quieter. There's the exhaustion that hangs over the settlement, not just physical, but something deeper. A spiritual fatigue. The sense that you're fighting a battle you don't understand against an enemy you can't see. In the afternoon, you're supposed to work on repairs. The barn wall is cracking. But you need iron tools to cut new stone, and your last good chisel broke 2 months ago. You've tried to forge new ones, but the iron is running out. The nails, the hinges, the blades, all of it came from Norway, and Norway isn't sending more. You're cannibalizing old tools to make new ones. You're pulling nails from abandoned buildings. There's a farm a mile down the fjord that's been empty for a year. The family just left one day, walked away, and no one talks about where they went. Maybe they tried to sail to Iceland on a fishing boat. Maybe they walked into the ice and didn't come back. You don't ask. The church bell rings for evening prayers. You go because everyone goes. Because the priest is watching. Because this is what keeps you human, keeps you civilized. The church is cold, colder than your house because it's bigger and built from stone and there's no way to heat it. You kneel on the floor and your knees ache, and you pray for deliverance, for ships, for spring, for enough food to last until the next harvest. You pray for your children. You pray that God hasn't forgotten you. The priest talks about Job, about suffering, about faith in the face of trials. He talks about how your hardship is a test, how enduring it proves your devotion. He doesn't mention that he still takes his share of your dwindling supplies. He doesn't mention that the bishop's estate still has sheep when you have none. After church, you see your neighbor. His name is Bjorn. His wife died last winter. Childbirth. The baby died too. There's no midwife anymore. The woman who used to do it, she died 3 years ago, and no one trained to replace her because everyone assumed the ships would bring a new one. Bjorn looks hollow. You ask him how he's managing. He says he's thinking about moving to the Western settlement. Heard they have better hunting there. You don't tell him that the Western settlement is emptying too. You heard it from a trader 2 summers ago. Farms abandoned, fewer people every year. But Bjorn needs hope, so you let him keep it. At night you lie awake and listen to the wind. It sounds like voices sometimes, like screaming. You think about the Inuit. You've seen them occasionally in their skin boats. Paddling through the fjords, they look warm, well fed. They catch seals with throwing spears, technique you don't understand. They wear furs that actually block the wind. Your wool doesn't. It gets wet and stays wet, and then you're colder than before. You've thought about asking them about learning, but you can't. It's not allowed. Not explicitly forbidden, but understood. You are Norse. They are Skraeling. There's a line. Crossing it means becoming one of them, and if you become one of them, what are you? What was the point of staying? What was the point of your grandfather sailing here, of building this farm, of maintaining the faith? You'd be erasing all of it. Better to freeze in wool than thrive in furs, at least that's what you tell yourself. But here's the thing that gnaws at you in the dark, the thought you don't say out loud. You're starting to doubt whether the ships are coming back. It's been 6 years. That's longer than any gap before, and you've heard stories third-hand from the last ship that did come. Stories about plague in Europe, about the Black Death, about 1/3 of Norway dying in a handful of years, about churches empty, farms abandoned, entire towns gone. If that's true, if Norway is devastated, why would they send ships here? Why would they care about a colony that barely profits even in good times? You're 5,000 people on an island of ice. They're dealing with millions dead. The math is ugly, but it's simple, and that's when you realize the terrible truth. You were never essential. You were a luxury, a prestige project. Look at us, the kings of Norway could say we have subjects in Greenland, we control the far north, we are a mighty realm. But prestige doesn't survive plague. It doesn't survive collapse. When the center is fighting to survive, the edges get cut off. And you're the edge, the very farthest edge, and no one is coming to tell you that you've been cut. You're just going to figure it out slowly, as the years pass and the ships don't come and your children get shorter, and your neighbors start disappearing, and the settlements start emptying, and the silence gets louder. Now, let me show you what the archaeological evidence reveals, because this is where the story gets forensic. When archaeologists excavate Norse Greenland graves from the late period, the 1300s and 1400s, they're not just finding skeletons, they're reading biological records of suffering. The bones tell stories that the sagas didn't write down. Isotope analysis, the chemical signature in your bones from what you ate, shows a dramatic shift. In the early period, the 1000s and 1100s, the Norse diet was heavily terrestrial. Cattle, sheep, goats, dairy. Exactly what you'd expect from Scandinavian farmers. The isotope ratios match Norway. But in the late period, the ratios shift. More marine mammals, more seals, the signature of desperation. You're eating things you said you'd never eat, breaking your own taboos, and it's still not enough. The skeletons themselves are smaller. Adult males from the late period average 4 to 5 inches shorter than their ancestors from the early period. That's not genetics. That's chronic childhood malnutrition, stunted growth from not enough food during the years when your body is supposed to be developing. Your children are literally shrinking, generation by generation. The bones also show extreme wear. Teeth ground down to nubs not from old age but from chewing hides, gnawing on things that aren't food because you're hungry and there's nothing else. Enamel hypoplasia, lines on your teeth that mark periods of severe nutritional stress, like rings on a tree. Each line is a winter you barely survived, and here's the detail that should chill you. The graves from the final period, the very last generation, show something even worse. Periosteal lesions, signs of scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. You get scurvy when you stop eating fresh plant matter or organ meat. It means you're down to dried fish and old grain and whatever scraps you can find. Your gums bleed, your teeth fall out, old wounds reopen. You're falling apart molecularly because your body can't repair itself anymore. And this is happening to a population that's surrounded by seals, surrounded by fish, surrounded by food. But you never learned to hunt properly. You never learned to preserve properly. You never learned, period. And now it's too late. But let me show you the detail that makes this absolutely unbearable. They find children's graves with adult-sized coffins. They find graves that are too shallow, barely scratched into the permafrost, because whoever dug them didn't have the strength to dig deeper. They find bodies buried in their clothes, still wearing wool, still wearing the costumes of Norwegian identity, even in death. No one switched to furs. No one adopted Inuit burial practices. You died the way you lived, stubbornly, uselessly, clinging to an identity that killed you. And then there's the churches. The cathedral at Gardar, the bishop's seat, keeps functioning almost to the very end. They find records of tithes collected into the early 1400s, which means even as people are starving, even as the settlements are collapsing, the church is still taking its share, still demanding payment, still maintaining the structure. Because the structure is the point. The system exists to perpetuate itself, not to serve the people trapped inside it. And you keep paying, because what else can you do? Refuse and be damned. You're already dying. At least if you pay, you die Christian. At least if you pay, you die with the hope of heaven. That hope is all you have left. Now here's where the story pivots from tragedy to something darker. Something about human nature and power and the mathematics of abandonment. Because the thing you need to understand is that this wasn't inevitable. The Inuit proved that. They lived in the same environment, colder even, farther north, and they thrived. Their population was growing while yours was collapsing. They had the same resources, the same animals, the same ice. The difference wasn't the land, it was culture. It was flexibility. It was the willingness to say, this doesn't work, let's try something else. And you couldn't do that, not because you were stupid. You weren't. You were farmers and craftsmen and priests, educated by medieval standards, literate in Latin, capable of sophisticated theology and trade and navigation. But you were trapped by identity, by the idea that there was a right way to live, a civilized way, a Christian way, and that deviating from it meant losing your soul. The Inuit didn't have that trap. They had a culture built around adaptation. If the seals moved, they moved. If one hunting method stopped working, they invented another. They didn't have a distant church telling them how to live. They didn't have a distant king demanding taxes. They didn't have an identity that required suffering to maintain. They were pragmatic. And pragmatism, in the Arctic, is the difference between life and death. But here's what makes the Norse situation even more tragic. There's evidence of contact, evidence that you knew the Inuit existed. You traded with them occasionally. Small exchanges, metal goods for furs. You wrote about them in your letters back to Norway, describing them as barbaric, but acknowledging their skill. You saw their boats, you saw their clothes, you saw their success, and you learned nothing. Because learning would have required humility. It would have required admitting that your way wasn't the best way, that the civilized world didn't have all the answers, that maybe, just maybe, the people you called savages had something to teach you. And you couldn't do it. Your priests wouldn't allow it. Your community wouldn't accept it. You wouldn't forgive yourself for it. So instead you froze, you starved, you shrank, you died. And you did it quietly without even the dignity of a final chronicle, a last letter, a recorded ending. You just stopped. The last Norse Greenlander died sometime in the 1400s, no one knows exactly when, and there was no one left to write it down. When Europeans finally returned to Greenland in the 1600s, they find ruins. They find the stone churches still standing, empty. They find collapsed farms. They find scattered bones. They find Inuit living in the old Norse settlements, using the stones for their own purposes, and they ask, what happened to the people who built these? And the Inuit don't know. It was before their time. The buildings were already abandoned when they arrived. There's no oral history, no battle story, no explanation, just absence. 5,000 people erased so completely that even their neighbors don't remember them dying. And here's the mechanism you need to see, because this pattern repeats throughout history over and over, in different contexts, different continents, different centuries. Step 1. A population becomes dependent on a distant system for survival. Trade routes, supply lines, imperial administration, whatever. They organize their entire society around that dependency. Step 2. The distant system's priorities shift. War, plague, economic collapse, political change. The reasons vary, but the result is the same. The population is no longer important enough to maintain. Step 3. The system withdraws, not with an announcement, not with a formal decision. Just quietly, through 1,000 small choices that all point the same direction. Ships stop coming, supplies stop flowing, communication stops happening, and the people on the ground don't realize it's permanent until it's too late. Step 4. The population tries to maintain the old ways, believing the system will return, believing their loyalty will be rewarded, believing that if they just hold on a little longer, everything will go back to normal. They wait. They pray. They pay their tithes and taxes to institutions that have already forgotten them. They refuse to adapt because adaptation would mean admitting the system has failed, and admitting that is psychologically impossible. Step 5. Death. Slow, quiet, unremarked. And when it's over, when the last person is gone, the system that abandoned them doesn't even notice. There's no accountability, no reckoning, just empty buildings and scattered bones, and eventually, if anyone bothers to investigate, a footnote in a history book that treats the whole thing as a mystery, as if there's something puzzling about what happened, when the truth is simple and brutal and depressingly predictable. The Norse Greenland colony is a case study in how systems fail people. But more than that, it's a case study in how people fail themselves. Because the systems, the church, the crown, the trade networks, they're abstract. They're distant. They don't have malice. They just have indifference. But you, the individual Norse Greenlander, you had agency. You could see the Inuit. You could see their methods working. You could have chosen to learn, to adapt, to survive. And you didn't. Not because it was impossible, but because it would have required giving up the story you told yourself about who you were. And that story mattered more than your life. So when we ask, why did 5,000 Vikings vanish from Greenland? The answer isn't mysterious. They didn't vanish, they died. They died because Norway stopped sending ships and they needed those ships. They died because the church kept taking tithes even as they starved. They died because the climate changed and they refused to change with it. They died because the Inuit had solutions and they refused to learn. They died because their identity, their sense of being Norse, being Christian, being civilized, was more important to them than survival. They chose death over transformation. And that choice That grinding generation by generation choice to cling to the old ways even as the old ways killed them, that's not a mystery. That's a decision. A collective decision made by individuals day after day, winter after winter, until there was no one left to make it anymore. And the thing that should terrify you is how familiar this pattern is, how often it repeats, not just in medieval colonies, but everywhere. Every time a community becomes so invested in an identity that they can't adapt when circumstances change. Every time a population trusts a system that stops caring whether they live or die. Every time people choose pride over pragmatism, tradition over survival, the comfort of the known over the uncertainty of the new. It happens, and it kills, and then it gets forgotten, or mythologized, or turned into a mystery when there was never any mystery at all. Just people making terrible choices for reasons that made sense to them at the time, and a system that let them die because their deaths were cheaper than their salvation. The Norse Greenlanders weren't stupid, they weren't weak, they were human, and that's what makes it so chilling, because we're human too. And the mechanisms that killed them, the dependence on distant systems, the rigidity of identity, the inability to admit when something isn't working, those mechanisms are still here, still operating, still claiming victims, just in different forms, different contexts, different scales, but the logic is the same. And if we don't see it, if we don't learn from it, if we keep telling ourselves that we're too smart or too modern or too connected for this to happen to us, then we're making the same mistake they made. We're choosing the comfort of the story over the harshness of the truth, and that choice has consequences. So here's what I want you to take from this. When you hear about the Greenland Norse, don't think of it as ancient history. Don't file it away as a curiosity, a weird footnote about Vikings who got lost in the ice. Think of it as a warning about what happens when systems abandon people, about what happens when people can't adapt, about what happens when identity becomes more important than survival. Think of it as a mirror, because the face looking back at you isn't medieval, it's contemporary, it's us. And the question isn't whether we'll face our own version of this. The question is whether we'll recognize it in time to do something different. 5,000 people died in Greenland over the course of a century. They died waiting for ships that never came. They died praying to a church that took everything and gave nothing back. They died surrounded by people who knew how to survive, and they died refusing to learn. They died because the world changed and they wouldn't, and their graves are still there under the permafrost, silent and forgotten, waiting for someone to dig them up and read the story written in their bones. The story that says, this is what happens when you value who you are more than whether you live. This is what happens when the system fails and you don't have a backup plan. This is what happens when you're too proud to admit you were wrong, and that's the legacy, not a mystery, a lesson, one we keep refusing to learn. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who doesn't look away from hard truths, and I respect that. Hit that like button. Subscribe, because the stories I cover aren't the sanitized versions you got in school. They're the ones that show you how power actually works, how systems actually fail, and how people actually die when those systems stop caring. Drop a comment and tell me, what's another moment in history where people died because they couldn't adapt, because the system abandoned them, or because their identity mattered more than their survival? I read every single one. And that is what really happened.